And then experience, it begins with this uninterpreted data, objective data, which is anchored to context, but then a transformation takes place through our perceptual mechanism, and a semantic state arises, and we make sense of what is in the world. Co-limit of a semantic diagram is what we are suggesting in the mathematical framework as the perceived reality, the phenomenal reality for a single conscious agent. We enter into an Instagram world, right? Now these worlds are becoming more and more real with every day passing, and these worlds, they don't preserve the semantic structures of our lived reality in which human life has evolved, and that is what creates the cognitive dissonance, and all the mental health issues are related because of this dissonance. So the future of AI systems and AI ethics, it has to go beyond just moderation of outputs to governing the mappings, the transformations that the systems are actually implementing. So I'm going to talk about valid cognition in the algorithmic age. So this work is at the intersection of consciousness studies and AI ethics. The references, that is the basis for this presentation, are mentioned here on this slide, the introductory slide. And in fact, Jyotiranjan is a co-author, and I'm very happy to have him as our like a very good collaborator. He was at IIT Mandi for 3 years, and we had 1 year overlap. So he has contributed significantly to this work. So here, the conference theme is about unriddling inference, and inference. With the word inference these days, you think more about training and inference rather than Pramana theory, which is classical Indian theories and approaches to draw valid inference. So it has been part of our core epistemological framework for thousands of years, but now inference is drawing a new meaning and a new context. So we need to have our approach. We need to contribute our thought process and our approach to this new world of inference that is coming about through the modern AI machines and so on. So here, we see the contrast. The modern AI has immense predictive power, which is based on information processing. But if we investigate these systems, they're epistemologically agnostic at surface level. In fact, they are not agnostic, they are biased epistemologically because of the training data, but the user may not be aware of those. The user is completely blind to the training process, and therefore from their perspective, from user's perspective, what is going on behind the scenes is not transparent. So because of this, it contrasts very much with the classical epistemological framework, where in Pramana theory you should have a basis for knowledge. The knowledge cannot have no basis, right? And as Varkhiriji was saying, that the knowledge always grounded in some meaning, some context. So that is the contrast over here. So we can go next. So for the slides that I'm going to present and the message that I'm going to communicate, I first try to give you a high level picture of what is about to come, so that we don't get lost in the details later on. So we first start with consciousness, treating consciousness as fundamental. So because experience is the very foundation of our existence, and experience is tied to the fact that we are conscious. Conscious awareness is there, therefore experience is there. Therefore, epistemology should be grounded in experience, which is whose basis is consciousness. So that is what we mean by saying consciousness is fundamental. It is fancy words, fancy way of saying things that is already very well known in all our shastras and our traditional knowledge systems. Then in order to bridge this idea that consciousness is fundamental and then everything emerges from it, we have to employ some mathematical tools to make it interpretable in the world of science. And for that, we use category theory tools. And in fact, Jyotiranjan is the one who pioneered this in the context of our work. With this, we draw insights and then come to the stage of understanding phenomenal reality, the reality that we experience with our senses, mind, and our perceptual apparatus, that we call as the phenomenal reality. Now, all our Shastras, also our scriptures, distinguish between phenomenal reality and the actual fundamental reality, underlying reality which gives rise to phenomena. So, we make that distinction, we are able to make that distinction, and in a very precise way, in a mathematical way. In this context, now once we say that the actual world differs from our perceptual or phenomenal world, then we can, in this framework, we can think of the AI systems as further transforming a phenomenal field of reality into another realm, which we call as the artificial screens. And these are, these are given some labels over here, like W prime, W double prime, and so on. And now, because we see the artificial screens or the perceptual field generated by AI systems as an extension of the phenomenal field which we naturally inhabit, the transformations should be such that they preserve certain semantic structures. They preserve meaning across these transformations. So, meaning therefore becomes very fundamental to our whole approach. And that determines how we govern these AI systems. So, it's like a continuous flow starting from consciousness to how we should be thinking of AI systems for humanity's benefit. Right? So the first thing is consciousness as being fundamental. I think this is not a new idea, neither it is being said for the first time. I think people in different segments, different sections of this scientific community are recognizing the importance and validity of this approach. Consciousness studies as a field, authentic field in science has become it has become an authentic field in science in the past 30-35 years. Before that, it stayed pretty much for few thousands years in the domain of philosophy. Now, we can take consciousness seriously. Why? Because we have this hard problem of consciousness which remains unsolved. The hard problem, in a stated and simple way, is that if we have a physical system and we say that consciousness is emerging from it, but consciousness is an entirely different aspect of reality. It's like a first person's view of understanding the world, whereas everything physical can be explained in a third person's perspective. So, how does everything in third person's perspective description give rise to first person perspective? How does that ever happen, or how is that even possible? So that philosophical issue is unsolved in philosophy, and it percolates into science either also. So therefore, it makes sense to stop thinking everything in terms of physical stuff and to take our first primary experience, first person point of view as primary, and try to go the other way around. Try to evolve the physical systems and the phenomenal world from consciousness, rather than taking the traditional or the by tradition here I mean the Western tradition, which tries to derive everything from the physical systems. So it's a non-reductive approach, and it actually is a novel way to do things, because it gives a unified, a holistic perspective from consciousness to matter. You can bring everything together in a cohesive way, while at the same time preserving these semantic structures that I mentioned, which naturally will lead to solution to ethics problems. In a natural manner, it will lead to solutions to big societal problems that we are challenged with today. So this foundational shift of thinking consciousness fundamental is very important to introduce formally into the scientific framework. Now that was about consciousness. The next is about the tools of category theory. This is in mathematics that we are trying to use. So category theory is pretty powerful tool. Why? Because it doesn't talk about individual objects in isolation or groups of objects, but it talks about relationships and structures between different objects. And you can use this to transform one category to another category using something like functions, but instead of simple functions which take you from x to y, these are called as functors, just to distinguish that you're going from one category to another. So you could be going from a category of raw data, which is pretty much meaningless. Let's say, frequency of light. It could have red frequency, yellow frequency, green frequency, just frequencies. But these frequencies do not by themselves contain meaning. But there is a process or a functor that can take you from this raw data to something, an experience which is meaningful. Like you could be seeing the Indian flag, and as soon as you see it, it means something to you. It's no longer raw data. So that transformation is enabled by what is known as these functors, and category theory enables these kind of transformations and precisely defining the relations between different objects. So that is like very basic, preliminary definition of or description of what is category theory, and then we employ certain concepts in category theory, which are a few foundational ones and few a bit advanced ones. One is called as the index category. The index category is a category of all context, local context. So we introduce context. Why? Because experience, which is our grounding aspect in the approach, the experience is always with respect to context. It doesn't take place in vacuum. It always has a context associated with it. So we start with context, and then on one side we can go from context to semantic content, which is the content of our meaningful experience. But from context we can also go to the raw state, which corresponds to the world in its basic format. And then we have this integrator functor, which goes from the raw state to semantic states, and I'll show you like better pictorial illustrations of this, but it's just a brief description. And then we have something called the semantic diagram, which is you can think of semantic states. They could be locally isolated, not interacting with each other, but semantic diagram, it tries to bring them together and makes family of relationships between semantic states. So it's like an evolution step by step from raw to evolved perspectives, which is meaningful. And the right side I'll talk about in some time. But this description, I thought a pictorial illustration or a metaphor would help to understand what is happening here. So it is like a bunch of explorers. They go into a new city and they want to map out the landscape of this city. So individual explorers have a limited vision of perception, and they can only see so much, and from that they map a part of it. But each one of them does that, but when in the end, when they come, their perspectives have to match, and they have to stitch together their perspectives to form this complete map over here, right? So category theory is actually giving us tools to build this from our individual perspectives, which we are all like units of consciousness. So we are localized perspectives we have as conscious agents, and our perspectives, when they glue together, and how does this phenomenal field that we are experiencing in the universe, how that is coming about, and we can all agree upon it, right? We all have a very unique perspective and a very unique way to experience this room, but when we all talk about this room, we can agree on many things, most of the things, right? So how does that translation really take place? So that formalism, category theory, is helping us do that. So context in this case is like a street corner that we can look at. The raw state is like the light frequency or the GPS coordinates. It's just raw data with respect to a certain place in the city. And the semantic state can be compared to once the raw data comes and is integrated, and it transforms into a meaningful a semantic state, which is like the view of a skyscraper building. So once you know that this is a building and this is a place where people work or people live, then that becomes a semantic state, and that transformation has taken place from the raw data. Okay, so that's the analogy, or that's the metaphor that is used over here to explain what is happening. So we have the actual world, and we actually don't have a direct perspective of the actual underlying world. And what is the world in this case, that we'll come to later. But we all know that experience takes place with respect to a context, and we know that there must be some raw state associated with every context. And then experience, it begins with this uninterpreted data, objective data, which is anchored to context, but then a transformation takes place through our perceptual mechanism, and a semantic state arises, and we make sense of what is in the world, right? So this is how meaning evolves. So the ontological commitment here, that means what is the basis for starting this kind of work. The two ontological commitments that we make is that there are multiple conscious units, and in this simple case, although there's an abstract mathematical definition that we're trying to build, but in the common language we can think of conscious agents as individual living beings, and they are individual centers of conscious experience, and they have a limited scope of perception. But there is another aspect which is called as the conscious whole. If consciousness is fundamental and individual conscious units are to interact with the world and interact with each other, because consciousness is fundamental, it cannot be done unless there is a common substrate on which these interactions can take place. And because consciousness is fundamental, this substrate needs to be of the character of consciousness, and that is what we call as the conscious whole. So conscious whole is the collective field for all conscious units, and individual conscious units, they provide local perspectives into the nature of the world. Now each conscious unit can be thought of just three basic processes, which is incoming data, which is perception. The second is integration, assimilation of this information in the form of raw data, and then that assimilation of raw data, and which gives rise to meaning, always drives some action. If we fundamentally think of what we are doing, how we are doing, then these basic processes are always there: perception, integration, and then that drives action. So now the integration is thought of as a functor in category theory, and it is starting with a raw state which is consisting of data, and then it builds a semantic state. In our city analogy, it starts with all kinds of raw information, but then at some point the building as a semantic state registers in our perception, and what does that transformation is this integrator labeled as I. We can just think of this as, in the common language, our senses as medium of perception, the mind and the intelligence, mana and buddhi, as the integration function, and then our action senses, the other set of senses, as the ones driving the action. Now once we have these local perspectives, this can first we talk at the level of one conscious agent. So different sensual modalities, they bring in different raw data, and then they correspond to different semantic states. But when we experience one unified whole. We are not experiencing the semantic states with respect to sound, with vision, with taste, individually fragmented in different places. What we always experience is a complete whole, where all are a part, or they are contributing, but the whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? So that aspect of our conscious experience or perception is available. We can do that mathematically with a function, with a feature called co-limit. Co-limit basically brings the different perspectives or from different modalities together, and it builds one unified whole. They are no longer fragmented. So for instance, there could be some overlap between these two, and there could be some redundant information, but how to glue it all together to make one unified whole without redundancy, to make it holistic, that function is achieved through a thing called co-limit. So co-limit of a semantic diagram is what we are suggesting in the mathematical framework as the perceived reality, the phenomenal reality for a single conscious agent. So to just state this in simple words, is that we have different sensual modalities through which information is coming, and the integration takes place in our system, in a perceptual system, and it gives rise to this phenomenal field of experience. So this field of experience is a construction. So we never think of the world as a pre-existing reality independent of our perception, which is a deviation from classical physics. So what we are suggesting here is that the phenomenal field of experience is not a pre-existing reality, but it is a actively constructed field through our perceptual system. Now this is a deviation from classical physics, because classical physics positions the observer as independent of the reality surrounding them, and it is always pre-existing reality, that which we are describing as a third person's perspective. So we are deviating from that, and that is natural. Why? Because we took consciousness as fundamental. So this completely changed our perspective on the nature of the world itself and the nature of perception. Now this has big implications. So we cannot deny that the world exists, right? The world must exist. But what we are just saying, the perceptual field which is emerging through our perceptual mechanism is not equivalent to the world. The world exists by itself. So how do we construct the world? So world is constructed by this by the another two attributes or aspects of category theory which are available to us. They are called as sheaf. This is called like sheaf related mathematics, and a global section, where in simple language what we can think of this as the sheaf is like, in our city analogy, it's like the blueprint rules. Because when individual perspectives are there should be rules according to which they combine and come together. And then the global section, it offers a unique global state that satisfies all local perspectives. So there are certain conditions that need to be met and should be following certain rules so that everything comes together, and that world, that global perspective, we can think of it as the world. So there is an underlying world which can be represented in some form of raw states, but that world is not directly accessible. So the world is only accessible indirectly through this perception process, and that generates the phenomenal field, right? So now we distinguish between W and W prime. So W is the world and W prime is the perceptual field. So but what we have done so far is that by taking consciousness as fundamental, we are able to now translate this, the wisdom which is there in our scriptures, we are able to actually formulate that in a very precise mathematical manner, which is that the phenomenal field, the phenomenal world, is distinct from the actual world. Now this phenomenal world is being constructed through our perceptual mechanism, which now is being modulated by the digital machinery or digital world to generate a screen on top of this perceptual screen. And that perceptual screen, is where the AI ethics part lies. But some of you may ask the question that what about the world of classical physics? Like, because we all agree that the table exists, right? It's not just in my perception, your perception, but we all agree that the world as we are observing it and where the world of physics is taking place, that also exists. And in order to not discard that, to accommodate that, we introduce another set of projection or this projection functors, where our perspectives, when we take out the invariant part of our each individual's perspective and glue it together, that forms the physical world. So it's a one layer away from the phenomenal world of all individual conscious agents. So we have all perceptual fields, but the invariant part of it, when it is taken and glued all together, which is why we have the second co-limit, then that gives rise to the world of physics, the classical world that we all can agree upon, and it seems like it's a pre-existing reality, but because we have introduced this formalism, we can clearly say that it is not a pre-existing, but it just appears to be so. W is at the underlying reality of underlying world which we have no direct access to.
So that is the union of W prime.
No, the W prime emerges from W. And then W prime emerges from W, but W prime is like individual perceptual fields. But when they all come together and you take out the subjective aspect related to, you filter it out, only the invariant part is left, then that is the W physics. That's right, yeah. So if we go back to the history of science, Galileo's famous words are there where he said that, the sense perceptions, in knowledge gathered through sense perception is not reliable. Why? Because yours is different, mine is different. So let's eliminate that from valid source of knowledge in science. So science by definition goes with numerics and quantities that we can both agree on. The length of this table is this much. No conflict there, right? But this table may seem yellow to me, it may seem pink to you. So therefore, that's not valid source of knowledge. Let's eliminate that. So that's how we have eliminated subjective attributes at the very beginning of science, and we have made a lot of progress with that. But now we have come to a stage where we can no longer ignore that mistake. So science has to be made again holistic, and the only way we can think of it is that we have to make consciousness as fundamental. We start with consciousness and then gradually move forward. Okay, now I'm going to go through quickly for the second part. Now what we are saying is that once we have this framework, W prime is our perceived reality, and what technology is really doing is doing a transformation on our lived phenomenal reality and creating another screen or another realm of reality. And the best way to visualize this is VR headsets. How many of you have tried a VR headset? So VR headset, once you try it, and at least for some time, it is immersive. It's like you've entered a new world, right? So that's an artificial screen created by technology. But it's not just VR. When you wear it, it creates artificial screens. Our mobiles, there is a physical screen, but when we are into WhatsApp messaging, we are in the WhatsApp world. We are entering subtly into a different world. We enter into an Instagram world, right? Now these worlds are becoming more and more real with every day passing, and these worlds, they don't preserve the semantic structures of our lived reality in which human life has evolved, and that is what creates the cognitive dissonance, and all the mental health issues are related because of this dissonance, right? So the technology is making these transformations, but the inventors of technologies and the implementers, executions of this technology, which is mostly the corporate world, they don't care about meaning and semantic preservation. But that is where we are stepping in and saying that the way we are visualizing the evolution of our perceptual mechanism, and artificial screen is a screen on top of that, we should include certain semantic or meaning preserving structures in these transformations, without which human life is really is going in a dangerous direction, right? We can, as Varkhaji also said, we cannot ignore these technologies. They help us increase productivity and new ways of knowing and interacting with the world, but we should know what they are doing to us in the meantime, like in the process. So here, instead of now I'm transitioning to the AI part, which is now instead of just thinking in terms of alignment, which is the way people think in terms of monitoring behaviors and outputs of AI systems. We have to think in terms of perception and construction of new worlds. Instead of in terms of more technical details, like instead of thinking of Shannon information, which is raw meaningless information, we have to think of semantic information, which has a meaning bearing structure, right? And instead of just focusing on safety, we have to think about semantic coherence. When W prime translates to W double prime, we have to see whether semantic coherence is preserved. And that we can measure only when semantic information is defined. And we can then avoid or prevent the semantic drifts from taking place. So, for example, the ill effects of social media on teenagers is now very, very well documented. And that's a classic case study of this such a transformation which affects negatively human lived experience, right? So, but if we have these systems in place where we can detect semantic drift and prevent it at the right time, then these negative effects can be avoided. The effect of AI interaction with AI systems is just going to be much higher than with social media. So this actually is very essential for humanity at this stage. So I'm giving some certain examples of like a actual building as a raw state, hospital as a semantic state. But if a transformation, artificial technology transformation is linking a hospital, which is a place of healing, meant place of healing, to retail engagement, then that's basically a breakage of the semantic coherence, right? So those are the things that we can implement and prevent. The last thing I'm going to say is about one is about semantic drift, where you are to some extent noticing that the drift is taking place, but maybe most of us are not in a position to come out of it voluntarily, right? But there is another one which is called as sovereignty. So the AI systems or technological systems, we actually don't know how they are manipulating our evolution of artificial screens. So without beforehand knowing how they are going to change our lived reality, we are subscribing to those and let just time decide our fate. But instead of that, we can very well define what AI systems do to our perceptual fields, and we can choose to take it or not take it, right? So that choice currently is not there, and that has to be an integral part of the epistemological framework, which is we're calling it as perceptual sovereignty. So to summarize, I mean, there are multiple layers that we're introducing in the realm of AI ethics, and most of the things that are taking place right now are superficial at operational and normative layers, which people are agreeing upon and implementing those. But because of consciousness fundamental approach, we are able to introduce another deeper layer of ethics, which is embedded in semantic coherence. Right. So the future of AI systems and AI ethics, it has to go beyond just moderation of outputs to governing the mappings, the transformations that the systems are actually implementing. So that's our So that is where we are going, and I'm going to just end by saying a little bit about a digital ecosystem that we are trying to build, where we not only preserve the semantic coherence, but we try to enhance the lived experience. So we have built, this is part of our project at ICMA Center at IIT Mandi, where we not only develop these theoretical tools and to do forefront science, but we also want to give benefit to the public at large by building these apps and other tools which go the other way, right? Instead of the harmful way, it tries to enhance the human experience. And I'll end with acknowledgement and like to thank our host institute IIT Mandi and the IK Center there. It's led by our director, Professor Lakshmidhar Behra, and these are the different areas of research and studies that we are involved into. If you'd like to connect and discuss any of the aspects, I'll be happy to do so. Yeah, thank you for your